Welcome to Hidden Chapters. This almost stayed invisible. They called my name before they called his. Not because I was there. But because my reputation had arrived ahead of me. That's when I realized what I'd passed on without meaning to. I was 3 time zones away when it happened. The trip was routine. Meetings, schedules, a timeline that made sense. The kind of travel where nothing feels urgent because everything has already been planned. I checked my phone between sessions out of habit, not expectation. The missed call came from a local number. Then another. By the third, I stepped out into the hallway and called back. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself. It didn't need to. I recognized the tone immediately, careful, professional, already carrying weight. They asked if I was the father. They didn't say my son's name first. They said mine. That was the moment I understood something had gone wrong in a way I couldn't rewind. The explanation came slowly. A confrontation near our neighborhood. Not planned. Not targeted. Just one of those situations that forms when people collide in the wrong place at the wrong time. Raised voices. Misunderstandings. Too many assumptions stacked too close together. My son had tried to de-escalate it. He'd done what I taught him to do, stay calm, speak clearly, avoid provoking anyone. But when it didn't work, when the situation kept tightening instead of loosening, he reached for the one thing he thought would create distance. My name. He said his father had served. That his father knew people. That this didn't need to go further. He believed authority would hear that and pause. Instead, it changed the room. People didn't calm down. They became alert. Cautious. Defensive. My reputation didn't soften the moment, it sharpened it. What my son meant as protection sounded like threat to someone already afraid. Things moved faster after that. Words stopped working. I was told someone else was involved. Someone who made a choice under pressure. A choice that ended a life before anyone understood what was happening. No details were offered. None were needed. Death doesn't require explanation to feel real. By the time the call ended, I was still standing in the same hallway, phone in my hand, surrounded by people who had no idea my entire sense of responsibility had just shifted. I'd spent years believing my service protected my family indirectly, through distance, through respect, through reputation. I never considered that it might follow them. Or that one day, my son would carry it into a moment that needed less weight, not more. As I booked the earliest flight home, one thought stayed with me, heavier than any consequence waiting on the other end. My name had arrived before I did. And someone else paid for it. The flight home felt longer than any deployment I'd ever taken. Not because of distance, but because of what waited on the other end. Missions have objectives. Clear exits. This didn't. Every update I received was careful, filtered through procedure and language meant to keep emotions contained. They told me my son was safe. They told me he was with his mother. They told me there would be questions later. They didn't tell me how many people were now connected to my name. When I landed, the city looked the same as it always had. Traffic. Noise. Normality continuing without hesitation. That disconnect, between the world moving forward and my own life stalling, felt almost unreal. At home, my son sat at the kitchen table, hands folded like he was waiting for permission to exist. He stood when he saw me, then stopped halfway, unsure whether a hug was allowed yet. I crossed the space between us and pulled him in before he could decide otherwise. He shook. Not with fear, with restraint. We sat without speaking for a long time. Silence does strange things after an incident. It grows heavier with every unasked question. Eventually, I asked him to tell me exactly what happened. Not what he thought I wanted to hear. Just what he remembered. He told me it started small. A disagreement. Someone pushing too hard. Someone else refusing to back down. He said he tried to walk away. Said it didn't work. When voices rose, attention followed. That's when he said my name. He said it calmly. The way I'd always spoken about my work, without drama, without threat. He believed it would shift the balance. Make people slow down. Make authority step in and separate everyone. Instead, the room changed. He described it carefully, like he was replaying a recording frame by frame. How people stiffened. How someone stepped closer instead of farther away. How a situation that had been unstable suddenly became charged with something sharper. Fear doesn't always retreat from power. Sometimes it challenges it. The rest came in fragments. Raised hands. Someone shouting that this didn't need to happen. A sudden movement that no one expected. Then a sound he couldn't place at first, not loud, not dramatic, just final. He stopped talking after that. I didn't push him. Some details don't belong to the moment they occur. They surface later, when the mind decides it's safe. What stayed with me wasn't what he described. It was what he hadn't expected. He hadn't known that my name carried weight he couldn't control. That it meant different things to different people. To him, it meant protection. To someone else, it meant risk. That misunderstanding cost someone their life. Later, alone, I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with my son about my service. Every time I'd downplayed danger. Every time I'd framed authority as stabilizing. I'd never meant to turn my past into a shield he'd feel obligated to use. But legacy doesn't ask permission. It transfers quietly. That night, as I sat in the dark living room listening to the house settle, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. My absence hadn't just left my family unprotected. It had left them interpreting my identity on their own. And in a moment that needed less weight. My name had added too much. The days that followed didn't move forward. They circled. Questions came in carefully timed intervals, always framed as procedure, never curiosity. Statements were taken. Clarifications requested. Each interaction felt less about understanding what happened and more about ensuring nothing moved beyond where it already was. My son wasn't treated as a suspect. He was treated as context. That distinction mattered. They asked him when he'd said my name. Who heard it? What tone he used. They didn't ask why the situation escalated after that. They didn't ask who panicked. They didn't ask who made the decision that couldn't be reversed. Those questions didn't fit the narrative forming around the incident. I recognized the pattern immediately. Not from my service, but from years of watching how systems protect stability over truth. The moment my name entered the situation, it had complicated things. Not legally. Symbolically. Someone had reacted to what they thought it represented. And now, everyone involved wanted that part minimized. At home, my son withdrew into routine. School. Meals. Sleep. He followed structure closely, the way people do when unpredictability has already taken enough from them. He didn't bring up the incident unless asked. When he did, he chose his words carefully. Too carefully. I asked him once what he thought had gone wrong. He hesitated, then said something I wasn't prepared for. I think they thought I was warning them, he said. Like I was saying something would happen if they didn't stop. That hit harder than any accusation. He hadn't meant it as a threat. He'd meant it as context, a reminder that adults existed, that authority would arrive and restore order. But fear doesn't interpret intent. It reacts to possibility. And possibility is dangerous in the wrong hands. I thought about the person who didn't go home that night. About how little their story would matter in the final version of events. About how quickly a life could be reduced to a complication no one wanted to acknowledge. My son didn't cause what happened. But he carried it. So did I. Not because of what I did, but because of what my reputation suggested to people who didn't know me. To them, my name wasn't about service or restraint. It was about consequence. That realization changed something fundamental in me. I'd spent years believing the distance between my work and my family kept them separate. That my past ended at the door. That whatever I carried didn't transfer unless I chose to explain it. I was wrong. Legacy doesn't move through intention. It moves through perception. And perception, once formed, acts on its own. That night, I sat with my son again, not as someone who could fix what had happened, but as someone who needed to acknowledge the weight he'd never meant to pass down. "I'm sorry," I said. "Not for my service. Not for being away. But for letting my name become something he thought he needed to use." He looked at me for a long time before responding. "I thought it would help," he said. "I know," I told him. "That's why it matters." Outside, the world continued the way it always does, uninterested in the cost of individual moments. But inside our home, something had shifted permanently. The idea that protection can become pressure. That reputation can become inheritance. And that sometimes, the most dangerous thing you pass on to your children is a name they believe will save them. The official process moved the way it always does after something irreversible. Slow enough to feel deliberate. Fast enough to feel finished. There were meetings I wasn't invited to and conclusions I was expected to accept. Language was chosen carefully, neutral words, passive constructions, statements that acknowledged an outcome without assigning weight to how it happened. A life had ended. But no one said that out loud anymore. What remained was procedure. I attended one briefing in person. A small room. 2 people. A table that had seen this kind of conversation before. They explained timelines, clarified roles, and emphasized how unusual the situation had been. They avoided one detail consistently. The moment my name entered the scene. When I brought it up, the response was immediate and smooth. That didn't materially affect the outcome. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was true or false, but because of how quickly it arrived. Someone had prepared it in advance. Someone had decided this aspect of the story needed to be sealed off before it created problems. Problems for who, they didn't say. My son was excused from further involvement shortly after. Not cleared. Not absolved. Just, removed. The system had everything it needed from him, and keeping him close no longer served a purpose. At home, he asked fewer questions. That worried me more than anger would have. Anger at least demands response. Silence adapts. One night, he asked if he should stop telling people what I used to do. The question landed harder than he intended. He wasn't asking out of shame. He was asking out of caution. "I don't know," I told him honestly. "But you don't owe anyone an explanation." He nodded, absorbing that like a rule. That's when I understood something else. He wasn't just learning how to talk about me. He was learning how to survive attention. The person who died had already started fading from conversations. Their name appeared less often. Their story shortened. What they were doing there became less relevant than how quickly everyone could move past it. That's how permanence erodes. Not through denial, but through omission. I reached out quietly, not to reopen the case, but to understand its boundaries. What could be said? What couldn't? Which questions would be met with silence instead of answers? The limits were clear. And intentional. The truth hadn't been buried. It had been trimmed. Anything that complicated the narrative, fear, misinterpretation, the power of reputation, had been cut away to preserve stability. Stability always comes at a cost. That night, I stood outside my son's room and listened to him breathe, counting the seconds between each rise and fall of his chest. I'd done that overseas, too, making sure people were still there without waking them. I realized how little separated those 2 habits. Protection and control use the same tools. The difference is intent. I didn't know yet what I would do with that understanding. I only knew this wasn't something I could leave unexamined, not for my sake, and not for his. Because if my name could turn a moment volatile once, it could do it again. And next time, the cost might not be survivable. After the briefings ended, there was a strange emptiness where urgency used to be. No more calls. No more updates. No more reminders that something irreversible had happened. That silence was supposed to mean resolution. Instead, it felt like avoidance. My son returned to school. Teachers spoke to him gently, the way adults do when they've been told to be careful but not informed enough to understand why. Friends avoided the subject entirely. They talked around it, never through it. That kind of distance leaves room for imagination. I noticed changes in him that didn't announce themselves. He stopped mentioning my past unless asked directly. When people did bring it up, he corrected them quickly, minimizing it. Downplaying things I'd once been proud of. I realized then that my reputation had shifted shape for him. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was a liability. One evening, we sat on the back steps after dinner. The sky was darkening, the quiet settling in that usually brings relief. He asked if what happened would follow him. Not legally. Personally. I told him the truth. Some things stay attached not because they're documented, but because they're remembered. By people who interpret events through their own fear and assumptions. What should I have done? He asked. The question wasn't about tactics. It was about inheritance. I told him something I'd never said out loud before. That name only means what you let it mean, I said. And you don't have to carry it the way I did. He listened carefully. That mattered. Because legacy doesn't end when you stop talking about it. It changes shape when you teach someone else how to hold it. Later that night, I went through old records I hadn't looked at in years. Commendations. Evaluations. Language that praised decisiveness and authority. Words that, in the wrong moment, could sound like promise or threat depending on who was listening. I understood then how easily my past could be misread. How easily someone could hear confidence and feel pressure. The person who died that night never knew me. Never heard my voice. Never saw my restraint. They only reacted to the idea of me, an outline filled in by fear. That realization didn't bring guilt. It brought responsibility. I couldn't undo what had happened. But I could decide what my name meant going forward, especially to my son. The next day, I told him something that surprised us both. If something feels wrong, I said, don't reach for who I was. Reach for who you are. He didn't respond right away. Then he nodded. Not because the answer satisfied him, but because it gave him ownership. For the first time since the incident, I felt like we were no longer reacting. We were choosing. The world outside hadn't changed. The system hadn't reversed itself. The story would remain incomplete in official records. But inside our home, something shifted. My name stopped being a weight he carried. And started becoming something he understood. Not as protection. Not as threat. But as a history he could step out from behind. Time didn't heal anything. It clarified. Weeks passed, then months, and the incident settled into the background the way unresolved things often do, not gone, just folded into daily life. The official version of events hardened into something neat and unchallenged. It became easier for people to reference it without thinking. For my son, it became something else entirely. I noticed it when a teacher mentioned my background during a parent meeting. Not dramatically. Just as context. The way adults sometimes fill silence with information they think is harmless. My son stiffened beside me. Later, in the car, he asked if he should correct people when they brought it up. I asked him what he thought. I don't want them expecting something from me, he said. Like I'm supposed to act a certain way. That was the cost I hadn't fully understood before. Expectations don't come from what you've done. They come from what people think you represent. And once attached, they're difficult to shake. The person who died that night was no longer discussed openly, but their absence still shaped the space around us. Certain places were avoided. Certain conversations cut short. It was like an invisible line had been drawn, and everyone agreed not to cross it. Agreement is powerful. It keeps things contained. But it also keeps them unresolved. One evening, my son told me he'd been asked a question at school. Not about the incident directly, about authority. About whether uniforms automatically meant safety. He hadn't known how to answer. That worried me more than anything else so far. Because it meant he was carrying doubt that didn't belong to him alone. We talked late that night. Not about tactics or right and wrong, but about complexity. About how authority can stabilize situations, and also destabilize them. About how fear doesn't always look dangerous until it reacts. I told him something I'd learned too late. Respect doesn't protect you if the other side feels threatened by it. He absorbed that quietly. In the days that followed, I made a deliberate choice. I stopped correcting people when they spoke about my past in abstract terms. I didn't confirm or deny. I let the details remain vague. Clarity invites expectation. Ambiguity creates space. I wanted my son to grow into himself, not into the outline others projected onto him. The world didn't notice the change. But he did. He began speaking more freely again. Less carefully. Like someone who no longer felt watched by an invisible standard he couldn't meet. That was progress. I realized then that the most dangerous part of legacy isn't pride or shame. It's momentum. It carries forward whether you intend it to or not. Unless you slow it down. Unless you teach the next person where it came from, and where it should stop. I couldn't remove my name from the past. But I could prevent it from dictating my son's future. And that, I understood now, was the responsibility that came with surviving something you never meant to pass on. There's a moment after something ends when you're not sure what replaces it. Not peace. Not relief. Just space. That's where we were. The incident no longer defined our days, but it hadn't released us either. It lingered in the background like a shape you stop seeing directly but still avoid instinctively. My son started spending more time away from the house. Not recklessly, just independently. Walking longer routes home. Staying late after school. Testing the boundaries of normal life again. I let him. Trust has to be rebuilt in the open, not enforced indoors. One afternoon, he came home quieter than usual. Not withdrawn, thoughtful. He said someone had asked him if what happened had changed how he felt about me. I asked what he'd said. That it made me see you as human, he replied. I didn't know whether to be relieved or unsettled by that. He explained that before, my past had felt fixed, a story already written. Something heavy and complete. After the incident, he realized it could be misread. Misused. Turned into something unintended. That scared me, he said. But it also made it smaller. Smaller. That word stayed with me. Legends grow because no one challenges them. Reality shrinks them back to scale. I told him something I'd never admitted before. I was afraid of that, I said. Of becoming something you couldn't question. He looked surprised. Parents aren't supposed to say that. But this wasn't about authority anymore. It was about honesty. The truth was, I'd spent years keeping my work separate from my family because I thought distance protected them. What I hadn't realized was that distance lets imagination fill in the gaps. Imagination is rarely gentle. That evening, we went for a walk. No destination. Just movement. The city around us carried on, indifferent and unburdened. People passed without recognizing us, without attaching meaning to our names or histories. That anonymity felt like relief. I asked him if he still thought about that night. Sometimes, he said. But not the way I did at first. How then? Like something that taught me what not to rely on. That was more wisdom than I'd had at his age. I realized then that the incident hadn't only taken something from us. It had clarified something. Power doesn't come from names or reputations. It comes from judgment, and judgment improves when it's questioned. My son hadn't lost faith in authority. He'd learned to evaluate it. That distinction mattered. As we walked home, I felt something settle into place. Not forgiveness. Not resolution. Alignment. We were no longer orbiting my past. We were moving forward on shared ground. The legacy I'd worried about passing down hadn't vanished. But it had changed shape. It was no longer a shadow he stood in. It was a lesson he could step away from. And carry only what he chose. Not everything needed to be resolved. That was the hardest lesson to accept. Some moments don't close cleanly. They don't offer apologies or clarity or a final explanation that makes sense of the damage. They just settle into memory, waiting to see how you'll carry them forward. I watched my son change in ways that weren't dramatic, but deliberate. He became more observant. Less reactive. He listened longer before speaking, and when he did speak, his words carried less urgency and more intention. He wasn't afraid. He was aware. That distinction mattered. One evening, he told me he'd been asked again about my background. This time, he didn't rush to correct anyone. He didn't deny it. He didn't elevate it either. He answered calmly, then redirected the conversation. They didn't push, he said. I think they were expecting more. Expectations again. I nodded. People often want stories to fit a shape they already understand. When they don't, curiosity fades. That's not a failure, it's freedom. At home, our conversations grew quieter, but deeper. We didn't revisit the incident unless one of us brought it up. It no longer needed constant attention to remain present. It had found its place. I noticed that my own relationship with my past had shifted too. I stopped feeling the need to contextualize it for others. I no longer framed it as protection or justification. It was simply something I had done, not something that needed to define anyone else. That felt lighter. One night, my son asked if I regretted the life I'd lived before. The question wasn't accusatory. It was curious. I told him I didn't regret the choices, but I did regret the assumptions. The belief that what I carried would always translate the way I intended it to. He considered that for a long time. I think everyone does that, he said. Assumes people hear what they mean. He was right. That's where most damage begins. The person who died that night remained unnamed in our conversations, not out of disrespect, but because naming them wouldn't bring understanding. What mattered was acknowledging the permanence of that loss, and the role perception had played in it. We honored that quietly. Not with ceremony. With restraint. I realized then that this was the version of legacy I wanted to pass on, not the weight of authority, but the discipline of restraint. Not the power to command attention, but the wisdom to avoid it when necessary. My son didn't need my name to protect him. He needed clarity. And clarity doesn't come from reputation. It comes from reflection. As I turned off the lights that night, I felt something I hadn't expected when this all began. Gratitude. Not for the incident itself, but for what it forced us to confront before it hardened into something irreversible. We couldn't change what had happened. But we could choose what it would mean. And that choice, made quietly, without witnesses, felt like the most important one I'd made in years. There was a point when I realized I'd stopped waiting for consequences. Not because I expected them to arrive late, but because I understood they already had. They just hadn't come in the form I'd anticipated. Nothing official reopened. No one revisited the incident. The system did what systems do best, it stabilized itself and moved on. Stability, I'd learned, doesn't mean justice. It means predictability. And predictability was restored. What didn't follow us was the fear I'd once expected to linger. My son didn't flinch when authority entered a room. He didn't challenge it either. He observed. Assessed. Chose his responses deliberately. That balance was new. One afternoon, he told me he'd been placed in a group project with someone whose family name carried a reputation of its own, loud, intimidating, widely known. He said the others deferred to that person automatically. "What did you do?" I asked. "I waited," he said. "Then I spoke when it mattered." That answer told me everything. He hadn't inherited my past. He'd learned from it. I thought back to the night my name had entered that confrontation, how quickly assumptions formed, how fast fear reshaped behavior. None of that had been rational. It had been reactive. A collision of stories instead of people. My son was learning something different. He was learning how to exist without becoming a symbol. That mattered more than anything else. I noticed the shift in myself too. I stopped bracing when people referenced my history. I stopped feeling responsible for how strangers interpreted it. Their reactions were theirs to manage. Responsibility doesn't extend indefinitely. It has boundaries. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, my son mentioned that someone had asked him if he felt safer because of who his father was. He smiled when he said it. I told them no, he said. I feel safer because I think more now. I laughed, not out of humor, but relief. The idea that my past had once amplified danger no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a warning that had already done its work. The person who died that night hadn't disappeared from my thoughts. They never would. Loss doesn't evaporate just because it's inconvenient. But it had found a place that didn't dominate every decision. It existed as a reminder. Not of guilt. But of responsibility without illusion. I realized then that the most meaningful outcome of that night wasn't what the system decided, or how the story was archived. It was what didn't get passed on. Fear. Blind trust. Inherited authority. Those things stopped with me. As we turned off the lights and the house settled into its quiet rhythm, I felt something close to peace, not because everything was resolved, but because what mattered most was no longer at risk of being misunderstood. Some legacies follow you whether you want them to or not. Others end because someone decides they should. And that decision, made quietly and deliberately, was finally enough. I used to believe that names were permanent. That once a reputation took shape, it followed you unchanged, through rooms, through years, through the people who carried it forward. I believed that because it made the past feel solid. Predictable. Easier to explain. I don't believe that anymore. What I understand now is that names only last as long as people keep using them the same way. The moment someone refuses to rely on them, they begin to lose their power. That's what happened here. The incident never resurfaced officially. It didn't need to. It had already done its work, not in records or outcomes, but in awareness. My son didn't forget it. Neither did I. But we stopped letting it define how we moved forward. Months later, I attended an event at his school. Nothing formal. Just parents and students in a gym that smelled like polish and old banners. A teacher introduced me to someone and mentioned my background out of habit. My son glanced at me. Then he spoke first. "That's part of his past," he said calmly. "It's not really relevant here." No challenge. No defensiveness. Just clarity. The conversation moved on. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I was holding. That was the moment I knew the legacy had shifted. Not erased, transformed. My name no longer arrived ahead of him. It no longer shaped the room before he entered it. It existed where it belonged, behind us, not between us. Later that night, we talked about it briefly. He said he didn't feel the need to protect himself with my history anymore. That he trusted his judgment more than borrowed authority. That trust had been earned the hard way. The person who lost their life that night remained part of our story, even if their name never appeared in any official summary. Their absence had consequences that reached further than any report ever would. We carried that with respect, not spectacle. I understood then that responsibility isn't about control. It's about restraint. About knowing when the weight you carry should be set down, especially when it risks becoming someone else's burden. The house was quiet as we turned in for the night. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary peace. Nothing dramatic. And for the first time since the call that changed everything, that felt enough. I didn't need my name to protect my son. He didn't need it to define himself. We had chosen something better. A future shaped by awareness, not inheritance. By judgment, not reputation. By presence, not assumption. Some stories are passed down loudly. Others end because someone decides they should. This was one of those stories. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it on Hidden Chapters. You can like the video and subscribe to hear the next chapter. And before you go, what changed because no one was there?